In the misty highlands of Armenia, the Church of St. Gregory stood abandoned for nearly 2 centuries, its stone walls crumbling beneath decades of harsh winters and neglect. When a restoration team arrived in early spring, led by architect David Avatissian and historian Karin Minashian, they expected to find faded frescoes and weathered inscriptions typical of medieval Armenian churches. What they didn't expect was the sealed crypt discovered beneath the altar during foundation repairs, accessible only through a narrow stone passage that smelled of earth and forgotten centuries. The air inside the crypt hung thick and still. As their lights pierced the darkness, David and Karin froze. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, with painted human eyes, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Wide, unblinking, staring directly outward with an intensity that made even seasoned archaeologists feel observed. The pupils were rendered in such precise detail that each eye seemed to possess its own consciousness, watching whoever dared enter this sacred underground chamber. The eyes belonged to no known artistic tradition they could immediately identify. They weren't Byzantine saints or Armenian martyrs rendered in typical iconographic style. These were raw, deliberate, unsettling, and they hid a secret. Scratched into the stone beneath several of the paintings were names, dates, and symbols that suggested this crypt had served a purpose far darker and more complex than simple burial. Someone had documented something here. Someone had wanted these eyes, these witnesses, to remember. What had occurred in this church centuries ago? Why had monks spent countless hours painting eyes into stone? And why had the knowledge of this crypt been so thoroughly erased from Armenian church records that even the current archbishop knew nothing of its existence? As David and Karin began their investigation, they would discover that some secrets are guarded by more than stone and soil, and that certain histories refuse to remain buried. Chapter 1. The Passage Below. The Church of St. Gregory clung to the Armenian highlands like a memory refusing to fade. Its khachkars, stone crosses, jutted from the earth around it, weathered sentinels marking centuries of prayer and loss. David Avatissian had spent 3 weeks documenting the exterior damage. Cracks spiderwebbing across the eastern wall, gaps where mortar had surrendered to frost, a roof that wept rain like an old wound. The restoration work was methodical. David's crew, 4 architects and a dozen local laborers, had begun carefully removing soil and debris from the foundation to assess structural integrity. It was Armin, one of the younger workers, who first noticed the rectangular outline of stone beneath the altar platform. Too deliberate to be natural, too perfectly aligned to be accidental. Karin Minashian arrived by afternoon. She was a historian specializing in medieval Armenian ecclesiastical records, contracted to document any artifacts before restoration began. When she saw the stone outline, she crouched in the dust, running her fingers along its edges. Her pulse quickened. "This wasn't on any survey," she said quietly. "No architect's drawing mentions a crypt here." David knelt beside her. "How is that possible? A structure this substantial?" "It isn't," Karin replied. "Not unless someone deliberately hid it. They worked carefully, using chisels and brushes rather than power tools." The rectangular outline became a doorframe. Behind it lay stairs descending into darkness. David retrieved lanterns from the van, battery-powered, bright enough to push back shadow but not bright enough to feel natural underground. They stood at the threshold hesitating. The air rising from below was cold and carried a mineral scent, ancient and undisturbed. Karin descended first, her boots finding purchase on worn stone steps. David followed, counting as he went. 14 steps. Then the passage opened into a chamber. Their lantern beams swept across walls of fitted stone, and both of them stopped breathing. Eyes, painted eyes covering every surface, some rendered in ochre and charcoal, others in pigments that had faded to near invisibility but remained visible to patient light. They stared outward from the walls with unsettling directness, wide, unblinking, deliberately varied in expression. Some seemed anguished, others serene. Many appeared accusatory. "My God," David whispered. Karin moved deeper into the chamber, her lantern casting moving shadows that made the painted eyes seem to follow her progress. She counted without realizing it. 37, 52. Nearly 100 visible at first glance, with more emerging from the gloom as their eyes adjusted. The floor beneath their feet was smooth stone, worn in places where countless feet had walked this same path. At the chamber's far end stood a stone altar, and beside it, carved into the wall, were inscriptions. Armenian script, Old Armenian script. Kareen's hands trembled as she focused her lantern on the nearest one. A name, a date, 1461, another inscription, another name, another date, 1463. They continued along the wall like a register of the dead, except the date stopped abruptly in 1485. After that, only the eyes remained. David photographed everything while Kareen transcribed the visible names into her notebook. The names meant nothing to them yet. The dates were late medieval. The painted eyes offered no explanation, only their relentless, patient observation. Outside the crypt, as evening light turned the Armenian landscape amber in shadow, David called the Archbishop in Echmiadzin. He needed to report what they'd found. He needed to know if the church authorities understood what lay beneath their own altar. The Archbishop's silence over the phone line lasted so long that David checked the connection. "Stay there," the Archbishop finally said. "Don't tell anyone else. I will send someone to verify." As David relayed this instruction to Kareen, both understood. The church knew something about this crypt, and that knowledge, deliberately kept from records hidden beneath stone and soil, suggested the true mystery of the painted eyes had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Witnesses. Kareen had spent a sleepless night in her hotel room in Gyumri, unable to remove the image of those eyes from her mind. She'd photographed the inscriptions with her phone camera, and now, studying them on her screen, she could see the patterns more clearly. The names repeated in clusters, groups of 3 or 4 marked together with the same date. Then other groups, different dates. By morning, she'd made a decision. She drove back to the church before sunrise, using the key the local priest had given her. The restoration work wouldn't resume until the Archbishop's representative arrived, but Kareen needed time alone in that crypt. She needed to examine the paintings more carefully, to understand the technique, the intention. The air underground felt colder in the pre-dawn darkness. She set up additional lanterns, creating a circle of light around the chamber. Only then did she truly see the sophistication of the work. These weren't the efforts of amateurs. Someone trained in religious iconography, had painted these eyes with precise control and purpose. She pulled out her notebook and began systematic documentation. The eyes varied dramatically in rendering. Some showed closed lids. Others stared with irises and pupils clearly rendered. A few showed tears. The positioning suggested they'd been painted over decades, perhaps centuries. Layers of pigment suggested some eyes had been repainted, reinforced, as if someone wanted to ensure they would never fade beyond recognition. Above the inscribed names on the far wall, she noticed something she'd missed in the initial shock of discovery. A symbol. Faint, but deliberate. It appeared above each cluster of names. A circle with vertical lines radiating from it. A sun? A crown? A halo? "It's a witness mark," a voice said behind her. Kareen spun. David stood at the chamber entrance, lantern in hand, looking disheveled and exhausted. He'd apparently driven through the night to return. "I've been thinking about this since midnight," David continued, descending into the crypt. "Look at the positioning of the eyes. They're not arranged randomly, they're organized, grouped. And the names below, they're not graves, Kareen. Graves would have death dates, family connections. These are just names and dates, like records, like witness statements." Kareen pointed to the symbol above the inscriptions. "What's that?" David moved closer, studying it. "A halo. A Byzantine tradition for depicting sanctity, but—" He trailed off, something troubling flickering across his face. Not all of these people were saints. Some of these names— He pulled out a notebook of his own. "I looked them up during the drive. I used my phone's connection at a rest stop. 3 of these names appear in Armenian church records from this period, but they're marked as heretics, condemned. excommunicated. The weight of this settled over both of them. Someone was documenting them, Karine said slowly. That's what this crypt was, a counter-record, an archive of people the official church rejected. Outside, the sun was rising. Somewhere above them, the bells of the Church of St. Gregory hung silent. In the crypt, the painted eyes continued their eternal observation, and Karine understood that she and David weren't the first to stand here understanding this truth. The question that needed answering was far older. What had these condemned souls done or believed that required them to be painted into memory, hidden beneath stone, guarded by watchful eyes that refused to let history forget? Chapter 3. The historian's discovery. The Archbishop's representative arrived by noon, a severe man named Father Grigor, who examined the crypt with an expression that shifted from skepticism to something approaching fear. He photographed nothing. He took no notes. He simply looked at the painted eyes, at the inscriptions, and then at Karine and David with an intensity that suggested he was evaluating their trustworthiness. "This cannot be made public," he said finally. "The church will need to investigate." "These are historical records," Karine protested. "People have a right to know." "People have a right to know what the church determines is appropriate for them to know," Father Grigor interrupted. "The restoration will continue, but this crypt will be sealed. Professionally. You will submit all photographs and notes to the diocesan office." He left within the hour, but his warning served only to accelerate Karine's research. She spent the next 3 days in the Mashtots repository in Yerevan, where Armenian medieval manuscripts were archived. If she was going to find answers, it would be in documents the church might not have fully catalogued, in footnotes and marginalia, where truth sometimes hid from official scrutiny. It was in a 16th century theological commentary that she found the first reference. A monk named Vahan had written in the margins of a holy text a single sentence in Old Armenian. "The eyes of the innocent watch still from beneath the altar at St. Gregory's, bearing witness to what we dared not record above." From there, the threads unraveled. Other marginalia. A passage in a monastic chronicle describing an inconvenient heresy at St. Gregory's in the year of the Great Frost. A letter from an archbishop dated 1492, decades after the painted eyes had ceased being added, expressing relief that the matter of the underground witnesses has been concluded and consigned to silence. By late afternoon, Karine had pieced together the outline of the history. Between 1461 and 1485, a group of monks and local believers at St. Gregory's had begun questioning official church doctrine. Their exact theological disagreement remained obscured by deliberate vagueness in the records. The church had been careful not to detail what they'd believed, but their rejection of certain authority was clear. They'd been called heretics, condemned, possibly executed. But instead of being erased entirely, someone, perhaps a sympathetic priest, perhaps a faithful family member, had preserved their memory in the only way possible, by painting them into the crypt, by literally surrounding them with eyes that would never close, never forget. A shrine of witness to the condemned. Karine sat in the library's reading room, her heart pounding, and realized what Father Grigor had understood immediately. These painted eyes represented a defiant act of memory against institutional erasure. They were a message across centuries, and that message, if publicly known, would complicate every simple narrative the church maintained about its own history. She photographed all the marginal references with her phone, careful to ensure the images weren't accessible through cloud storage. Then she called David. "We need to go back," she said. "Tonight. I need to see something about those symbols above the names. I think I know what they mean, and if I'm right, this story is much larger than anyone in the church wants it to be." David arrived at the church just after sunset. The restoration crew had gone for the day, leaving the site quiet under emerging stars. The crypt's entrance was still unsealed. Father Grigor's order to seal it couldn't be executed until contractors arrived next week. Together they descended again into the Chamber of Eyes. Karina positioned her lantern directly above the inscribed names, studying the halos more carefully. They weren't all identical. Some contained faint additional markings within their circles. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. She began photographing them methodically, zooming in to capture details previously invisible. It took nearly an hour, but finally she saw it. Within several of the halos, barely visible beneath layers of pigment and centuries of dust, were additional symbols, Armenian letters, letters that, when combined, spelled a single word, martyros, the witnesses. They named them, David whispered. Even though the church tried to erase them, someone made sure they'd be called what they were, the witnesses, the martyrs who died for refusing to accept lies. Karine felt tears on her cheeks. The painted eyes around them seemed suddenly less unsettling and far more sacred. They were not the eyes of accusers, but of testifiers, of souls refusing to be forgotten, their image painted into stone as a defiant act of faith. "We can't let the church seal this," Karine said. "We can't stop them," David replied. "But we can make sure the story exists before they do." Chapter 4. The rival claim. The next morning, Karine woke to 12 missed calls from an unknown number. When she called back, a woman's voice, cultured, urgent, identified herself as Dr. Anahit Boyajian, director of the Armenian National Institute for Historical Recovery in Beirut. "I've heard rumors about a discovery at St. Gregory's," Dr. Boyajian said without preamble. "Painted images, possibly medieval martyrdom records. Is this accurate?" Karine's mouth went dry. "How did you hear that?" "I have contacts at every major Armenian religious site. Someone in the archdiocese reached out to me. Not officially, you understand, but quietly. They believe this discovery is significant enough to warrant independent scholarly review, before the church seals it permanently." A pause. "They mentioned your name. They said you're trustworthy." Within 6 hours, Dr. Boyajian had arranged to visit the church. She arrived by car from Aleppo, bringing with her 2 graduate researchers and enough equipment to establish a professional archaeological documentation station. She was a woman in her 60s with intense dark eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to moving through bureaucratic resistance. "The church wants this sealed, but they want it sealed correctly," Dr. Boyajian explained as they gathered outside the church. "Which means it needs to be professionally documented first. There's a protocol for significant ecclesiastical discoveries. If we follow it properly, the documentation becomes part of the permanent record, regardless of whether the physical site is sealed." David understood immediately. "You're creating a permanent archive that the church can't deny without looking like they're destroying history." "Precisely," Dr. Boyajian said. "Now show me these painted witnesses." The work was meticulous and rapid. By nightfall, the crypt had been photographed from 17 angles. The inscriptions had been carefully transcribed and compared against historical records that Dr. Boyajian's team accessed through an Armenian studies database. She worked with focused intensity, her researchers moving with practiced efficiency. But late that evening, as the team was packing equipment, David noticed something troubling. A black SUV had parked at the church entrance nearly an hour ago. 2 men sat inside, engine running, clearly watching the documentation work. He mentioned this to Dr. Boyajian, who went still for a moment before nodding with apparent recognition. "The rival claim," she said quietly. "I was wondering when they would emerge." "Rival claim?" Karine asked. "There are collectors," Dr. Boyajian explained, "legitimate ones and otherwise. When word circulates about significant medieval ecclesiastical artifacts, especially ones the official church wants to suppress, private collectors sometimes become interested. These eyes, if they're as significant as they appear to be, might be considered historically irreplaceable." "You mean someone might try to remove them?" David said. "Steal them." "Not steal, precisely. They would frame it as preservation, as rescue." Dr. Boyajian watched the black SUV. "But yes, the painted walls could potentially be removed and sold to private collections. Some of the most important Armenian medieval art has disappeared this way. The church seals the crypt. Contractors arrive. A section is accidentally damaged during work. The damaged sections are carefully preserved and safeguarded by interested parties. A chill ran through both Karine and David. "How do we stop it?" Karine asked. "We ensure the documentation is so thorough, so public, that the work becomes more valuable preserved in situ than transported," Dr. Boyajian said. "We make this story too large to ignore or suppress. Which means," she looked at Karine directly, "we need to go public. Tonight, before the church can fully seal the crypt, and before those men in the SUV decide to act." Chapter 5. The Race Against Time. Karine didn't ask permission. By midnight, she'd uploaded detailed photographs of the painted eyes and inscriptions to academic databases, tagged with preliminary analysis. Dr. Boyajian's team had submitted preliminary findings to the International Journal of Eastern Mediterranean Archaeology. David had contacted journalists at Azad Hayat News and the BBC. The church's phone lines lit up before dawn with inquiries. By 6 a.m., Father Grigor had arrived at the church, his face flushed with fury. Behind him came two contractors with equipment that suggested their purpose, sealing the entrance with permanent concrete. "This is desecration," Father Grigor declared, "publishing sacred church records without permission." "These aren't sacred church records," Dr. Boyajian interrupted calmly. "These are evidence of ecclesiastical suppression and erasure. They're historical documents that the official church rejected and tried to bury. That makes them patrimony of Armenian cultural heritage, not private church property. The UNESCO guidelines are quite clear on this." She stood with her team and the growing crowd of journalists who'd arrived in response to the media alerts. The black SUV that had been watching the site the previous evening had vanished, but not before photographing the documentation work. "You have no authority," Father Grigor said coldly. "I have documentation," Dr. Boyajian replied. "And I have witnesses. The story is already public. Sealing the crypt now would only confirm the church's desire to suppress historical truth." It was a standoff, and Father Grigor knew it. Sealing the crypt with international media observing would generate exactly the kind of scrutiny the church had hoped to avoid. He stood rigid for several long moments, calculating. Finally, he turned to the contractors. "Leave," he said. "We will address this through proper ecclesiastical channels." As the contractors departed and the journalists called after Father Grigor with questions, Dr. Boyajian exchanged a look with Karine and David. They had won a temporary victory, but not the war. The church would find other ways to control this narrative: delays, bureaucratic obstruction, questioning scholarly credentials. What they needed was to understand the full story behind the painted eyes. What they needed was the revelation that would make the crypt's preservation so historically important that no authority could justify sealing it away. "The names," David said. "Some of them might have descendants still living in Armenia. If we could find them, if we could document that this is a family legacy." "The church hasn't forbidden your restoration work," Dr. Boyajian added. "You still have access to the building. You can spend time in the crypt, documenting architectural details, surveying the structure. If you were to find something else while conducting that legitimate work, something physical, something that changes our understanding of why this crypt was created, it would shift everything." That afternoon, while journalists were interviewing Dr. Boyajian outside the church, Karine and David descended again into the crypt alone. They carried flashlights and measurement tools, conducting what appeared to be routine architectural survey work. The crypt was roughly 15 meters long and 8 meters wide. Karine had always focused on the walls and inscriptions, but David began examining the floor more carefully. The stone was worn smooth in some places, unnaturally so. He pressed his palm against it, feeling for texture. Under the altar, where the stone should have been solid, David felt a slight depression. He knelt, running his fingers along it. A seam, carefully hidden but present. It was another chamber below. Karine joined him, and together they examined the floor around the altar more thoroughly. The stone was worked differently here, more recent than the surrounding stone, perhaps 400 or 500 years old rather than medieval. Someone had sealed whatever lay beneath it centuries after the painted eyes had been created. "If we remove these stones," David whispered, We might find why this crypt was truly created, why people were willing to defy the church to preserve these painted eyes. And if we don't, Karine replied, the secret dies with the sealed crypt. They had perhaps 2 hours before the journalist left and the church reasserted control over the site. 2 hours to make a choice that would either complete the historical record or desecrate a sacred space. David looked at the painted eyes surrounding them, as if seeking permission or guidance. Across centuries, from people the church had condemned as heretics, the answer seemed clear. Witness. Remember. Don't let them be erased. He reached for his tools. Chapter 6. The True Witness. The stones beneath the altar came loose more easily than expected, as if centuries of prayer and contemplation had loosened mortar that should have held firm. Beneath them lay a chamber barely a meter deep, not empty, but deliberately filled with something protected by layers of cloth so ancient it crumbled at the gentlest touch. Inside the cloth were papers, dozens of them, manuscripts in Armenian script, carefully preserved in ink that had endured 5 centuries. Karine's hands trembled as she photographed them, and with each image she recognized what these truly were. Confessions, testimonies, a record of what the condemned souls in the painted eyes had actually believed, written in their own hands before their deaths. One manuscript bore the name Varden, one of the names inscribed on the crypt walls. His handwriting was precise, educated. The text was a theological argument that even to Karine's limited medieval Armenian comprehension seemed entirely orthodox. He was arguing for church unity, for peaceful resolution of the theological dispute that had divided the monastery. This doesn't make sense, David said, watching her read. If his writings are this reasonable, why was he branded a heretic? Karine read further, her eyes widening. There, a footnote in different handwriting, added centuries later. A note explaining that Varden and his companions hadn't been condemned for heresy at all. They'd been condemned for witnessing. They had seen something, documented something so politically dangerous to the ecclesiastical hierarchy that the church had chose erasure over explanation. The final manuscript bore different handwriting, official, authoritative. It was signed by an archbishop whose name appeared in historical records. It was a confession of its own. An admission that Varden and the others had been silenced not for theological error, but for discovering evidence of corruption within the church hierarchy. Financial misappropriation, abuse of power, crimes that threatened the institution's legitimacy. The archbishop had arranged their condemnation through falsified charges of heresy. He had painted their eyes into the crypt as a way of, Karine understood now, acknowledging their truth even as he suppressed it publicly. A private guilt, a painted memorial to souls silenced for doing the right thing. She showed David the passage, her voice barely steady as she translated, I have ordered the sealing of their testimonies beneath sacred ground so that God alone may know their truth. I have painted their eyes so that in my final prayers, I am reminded that they watched me, that they see, that I cannot escape judgment, though the world will know nothing of this. Let their painted eyes be my penance, and let those who come after understand. The witness cannot be killed, only hidden, and hidden things inevitably emerge. Dr. Boyajian was waiting at the church entrance when they emerged, dawn light breaking across the Armenian highlands. She read the critical passages without comment, but her expression shifted from scholarly interest to something deeper, a recognition of what these manuscripts meant. This is extraordinary, she said finally. This is proof that the church suppressed documentation of institutional crimes. This proves the heresy charges were fabricated. These names, Varden, Grigor, Anahit, they're martyrs to integrity itself. Their eyes in that crypt aren't just witness marks. They're the painted conscience of an institution. Within hours, the story had spread through academic networks and news outlets. UNESCO sent representatives. The Armenian National Commission for Preservation of Cultural Heritage declared the crypt a protected site. The manuscripts were examined by conservation specialists who confirmed their authenticity and age. The church, facing historical evidence it could no longer suppress, made a strategic retreat. The crypt would be preserved, the manuscripts archived, and the story included in official Armenian ecclesiastical history, not as a source of shame, Father Grigor claimed in a statement, but as evidence of the Church's capacity for self-correction and accountability. Karina and David knew better. The painted eyes had won, not because they'd changed hearts, history rarely does that, but because they'd been too visible, too persistent, too deliberately placed to ignore any longer. Someone centuries ago had made certain that witness would outlast silence. On the final day of documentation, Karine stood alone in the crypt, lantern casting light across the painted eyes. She thought of Varden and the others, how they'd trusted that someone eventually would understand. That time itself would become their advocate. "Thank you," she whispered to the painted eyes surrounding her, "for refusing to be erased." The eyes seemed to stare back with the same quiet intensity they'd maintained for 500 years. Not accusing, but testifying. Not demanding revenge, but insisting on remembrance. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.